It's Fill Your Plate Now, where every bite brings you closer to the farm gate and further from what's unhealthy. Now here's your hosts, Julie and Tammy, helping you live well by filling your plate well.
Well, Tammy, we're going to get to be gate to plate on a very important issue with a centerpiece item on our menu, beef, because we brought one of our ranchers in.
That's great. I love beef, and I love talking about beef.
Yes.
This is going to be a fun episode.
It will be very fun, and who we brought on is Stephanie Smallhouse, Southern Arizona rancher. Hello. And I'm going to kind of give an introduction on you before we launch into all these questions that we're going to ask you. And we've got quite a few questions. Are you ready?
I think I'm ready.
Okay. Well, I first wanted to highlight for our audience that you served as our president of the Arizona Farm Bureau from 2017 to 2024. And you and your husband, Andy, own and operate a 6th-generation farm and ranch along the lower San Pedro River in southeast Arizona. So, beautiful country. I've been there, went on a hike. Barely made the hike. I don't know if you remember that.
It's rough country. I do remember that. That was fun, though.
It was fun. The ranch was established in 1884 and raises English cross cattle. The farm is used mainly to grow forage crops for your cattle. And in 2013, you added a saguaro cactus nursery, so you're very diversified. Are you guys still doing the mesquite wood?
Now and again, if it comes up, but it's not something we focus on. So.
Or push. It's
Yeah.
kind of like by request. And then with your education and background, you also have worked professionally as a wildlife biologist and resource consultant very early on in your career. And then later in executive administrative positions for the Arizona Association of Conservation Districts. I remember that. You know, the time is flying.
Seems like a long time ago. It was.
It was. And then the Arizona Water Protection Fund for the state of Arizona's Department of Water Resources. But first and foremost, you like to emphasize that you married into a ranch family and a generational one. So welcome and thank you for being part of Fill Your Plate Now. Like we often say, we're gate to plate, farm gate to plate, ranch gate to plate.
Yeah.
And Tammy is our nutritionist, and I'm the farm girl. So we're ready to dive into today's discussion. So give us your Genesis story, and especially how you met Andy, because you know you didn't grow up in Arizona.
I didn't grow up in Arizona. I didn't grow up in agriculture. I spent a lot of my life in a very small town in eastern Colorado, so rural life and the rural environment culture, it was not foreign to me at all. But my husband and I met at New Mexico State University, so that's where I got my degree in wildlife and range, and he got a degree in animal science and range. And his family background, like I said, I don't like to take credit for the generations. I get credit for one generation that's coming up. I get credit for the 6th generation. But many generations before, they came from Kansas, moved to Arizona because of health issues, like a lot of people did back in the day, tuberculosis and things. People want to move out to a drier climate. So they brought their brand, which is the CarLink brand, which a lot of people ask me what the simplest brand ever. It's just a squashed O. A lot of people ask me about that, and it's basically the train link, the iron link that goes in between the train cars.
Oh,
and
fun.
So somebody in the family had the idea that that's going to be their brand. So they brought that over from Highland, Kansas, started out in the Cochise stronghold, and then moved up to the San Pedro River in 1884. And so Andy's, I guess it would be his great-great-grandfather, started the ranch. We started farming shortly thereafter in the early 1900s. It's always been recognized that it's helpful to have farming in the cattle business in Arizona. But I have a son and a daughter. My daughter's going to school in Nebraska right now, but still very involved in agriculture there in her job. And my son just graduated from high school, and he'll be the 6th generation. He's very interested in the ranch. In fact, he would rather stay and work than go to college, but he is going to college.
He did promise my mom and dad that he would.
Yeah, yeah. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, he's very much focused on being the next generation to own and operate the ranch. So
Awesome. And we have a lot of ranch families that are 100 plus years old, like yours. In fact, sometimes there's often a debate amongst you if you're like 1 or 2 years difference in that 100+ year generational ranch family.
Yeah, I make a shout out to the King Anvil Ranch because they're the ones that we're going back and forth with. We just told them if they had started having kids earlier, they might catch up with us. But
It's amazing, and something for us to be proud of here in Arizona is these generational ranch families.
Oh, absolutely. I work with dairy industry and the same kind of thing, a family business. They're multi-generational, and having a ranch that's been around for 5 going on 6 generations, I'm sure that there's been lots of peaks and valleys throughout the times. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the passions or some of the resiliency that you've seen over time, or that some of your family members have seen going through all of these ups and downs?
sure, I think that, in the industry as itself, in agriculture, whether you're farming or ranching, there's the business side of it, and then there's sort of the cultural, emotional side of it, and the passion, and especially in multiple generations. There's something to say for being able to look in any direction, from your front porch and see things that have literally been there for 100 years and built along that time process by different generations. And so it obviously gives you a connection that's very deep and can be, is emotional, but you also have to be able to make money so that you can stay there. And so, over the years, the Carlink Ranch and the farm, at one point they tried to grow cotton out there. Yeah, we still have a cotton picker out in our graveyard, but they've grown cotton, they grew squash, tried to grow squash once and sell it commercially. We've done charcoal. We had a charcoal business back in the 50s because of the mesquite, wanted to get rid of the mesquite, and so selling that into California, I think. And so we've done a lot of different things. We've most recently, Andy and I, we started the mesquite business, selling custom mesquite to folks for high-end houses. That sort of came to a halt during the recession in '08. So, it's like you start something and it works for a while and then it doesn't work anymore. And that could be to a lot of factors. It could be due to the market. It could be due to just the general economy, like with the mesquite. It could be due to the weather and the drought. Andy's father, the first really extended drought that we experienced during the time period when ranchers really became resource managers. During that time, his dad had to make some decisions about what does it take to survive in this climate. This climate's great for ranching, but it can be really tough on you too. And so he at that time decided to clear a lot of acres for more farmland than we had originally. And, did it on an old cable car or cable operated cat. And, Andy talks about that a lot because it was something that he saw through much of his growing up. He was telling me a story the other day how his dad rigged up, this was before they considered themselves farmers, and his dad rigged up some kind of deal on the back of a pickup truck that Andy would sit on the back of the truck and it would spin out the seed to plant where he had cleared the mesquite. And when it was out of seed, he would bang on the tailgate to let his dad know that it was out of seed, and his dad would come back. And so that was the kind of farming that wasn't that long ago, which is, well, I guess it was, I forget how old I am, but 40, 50 years ago. So you just start out with what you've got and you get through the things you have to get through. And then Andy and I experienced a really rough time period in the early 2000s, another cycle of drought. And if we hadn't have had those farm fields that his dad cleared at that time, nobody else was really doing that. And it wasn't profitable. He was spending a lot of money to just clear trees, right? And put in that infrastructure. And so, if we hadn't had that in the early 2000s, we likely would have gone out of business because we had to sell off 75% of our herd and bring them all onto the farms to sustain ourselves for probably 4 or 5 years before we could start keeping heifers again. So I think every generation, you come into that generation and you say, okay, you're going to be successful in some ways and you're not going to be successful in other ways. What really matters is how do you navigate through those difficult times to get to the next good cycle, right? So,
and for clarification, clearing areas, pulling out trees, a lot of that was so that you had pasture for raising forage so that you could bale hay and you'd be able to put the remaining, 25% of that cattle herd during that drought, you could feed them on your own.
And back then it wasn't about making hay really per se because we didn't have all the equipment to do that. It was about being able to control a feed source when you can't, so you can get irrigation in place. Back then, everything was flood irrigation. Then we moved to side rolls and then, continuous center pivots, so have you. But at that point, it was just Bermuda. It was just planting Bermuda and watering it so that during droughts, we would have that to go to. But more importantly, he recognized that our rotational system would depend upon it. So we bring all of our cattle off of our state lease land and our federal land during the growing season. And that's so that the plant can produce that seed. And then we put them back up after the seed is dropped and they're dry, because you're basically, as cattlemen, you're basically a grass farmer, right? You manage that crop just like you would something else. And so you have to get the cattle off there at the right time. And if we hadn't had the fields, it would have been more difficult for us to do that.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard more than one rancher say that we're basically grass farmers. So I want then, going forward on this, what lessons from your family's long history in ranching have been most valuable to you and Andy, especially as it relates to navigating those modern challenges like the animal activists that are trying to put ranchers out of business, market volatility. Sometimes prices are great, sometimes they're horrible, especially you're selling on the commodity market.
Yeah, I think overall the biggest lesson is just to keep going.
Yeah.
Do not shy away from challenges and be creative and innovative. Markets, we don't have any control over the markets. What you can do, though, is you can prepare for the good cycles. And I feel like, I'm going to brag on Andy a little bit because I think he deserves it after, I never brag on him, but I'll say one nice thing about him.
And this is this will be recorded
That's
for
right.
posterity.
I want him to remember that this one time I said something nice. But no, when we were during that drought and we sold off 75% of our herd, that would be, in any situation, in any business, that would be very disheartening. And it'd be like, where do we go from here? And I don't remember Andy missing a beat because, and also, to clarify, his father passed away suddenly about 2 years before we had to start liquidating all those cattle. And so he had about 2 years to figure out where all the light switches were. He grew up on the ranch, but he wasn't really working on the ranch until he got back from college. His father passed away suddenly, like 2 years after he got back. And there's a lot, Julie, and there's a lot to learn on a farm, right, about different things. And there's never enough time to teach your kids about it. And so we were dealing with the emotional strife of losing his dad suddenly. We were dealing with the drought. And I don't remember him missing a beat. He just basically said, what do I do? What am I going to do? And so, we had sold off a lot of cattle, but, we leaned a lot on programs that are in the Farm Bill. A lot of people think the Farm Bill is just handing out money to people in agriculture. No, what it's doing is it's helping you get through those horrible times so that this country sustains its food production. Because every farmer, I don't care who you are, every farmer and every rancher will go through some period of time where there's a fine line between staying in business and not. And those Farm Bill programs are that safety net. And so we took advantage of EQIP and which is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And what it does is it helps farmers and ranchers invest in conservation practices. And so Andy decided, this is the time when we are going to work really hard to improve our systems so that when we do have rain and we do have more cattle back, we can manage them properly and we can manage our water. So we invested in better irrigation during that time. And it was really rough. We invested. And then after we did a lot of those investments, we put in new fencing, new pasture lands, all of these things. And then after that period passed, we started retaining heifers. That's also hard because you're basically holding on to your inventory when you want to sell it so badly. And I remember still in 2014, in the peak that we had in the market at that time, I remember Andy and I having this conversation, and we thought that would be the only time we'd ever see good prices. In two generations, I would say that this last cycle, last year and a half, is the first time that I've seen and Andy's seen ranching be profitable. And so, in 2014, it was like, sell everything, Andy. He said, nope, we're going to hold. And so you just have to, the lessons are always be looking ahead. And when you're in that valley, even though as much as you hate the fact of making decisions that seem counter to what you should be doing, you should make those decisions because that's the only way you're going to prepare for when times are good. Otherwise, you miss out on the cycle. Right? Agriculture is cyclical in every single way, whether that's the weather, whether that's commodity prices, just the actual act of farming and ranching. So I think that, the real lesson in that is to keep going. Animal activists, you mentioned that. I worry more about radical environmental people than I do about animal activists, because the fact of the matter is beef demand is high. I think it's going to stay high because people recognize the nutritional values and people just like beef. I mean, it just tastes good. And those people way outnumber animal activists. On the other hand, people that are very zealous in the environmental world really have the opportunity to impact policy. And I feel like, that can be more challenging. And what I've learned over the years and what Andy has learned over the years and what his father told him was, you have to get off the ranch. You have to be involved in policy. Yes, you love this lifestyle. Yes, you love being out here. But you have to get off the ranch because other people are going to decide your fate for you. And so, I think that's also a valuable lesson, is that it really doesn't matter what the threat is. You have to be able to engage and get out there and participate in your own future, basically.
And I want to tell a little story on Stephanie just because I know her so well. But you and Andy both were front and center involved in Farm Bureau, and then your father-in-law passed away, and so they kind of had to split duties, and I may be not telling it fully, but Andy kind of looked at you and said, "Okay, you're the one that's going to have to work policy."
Yeah, which was horrifying to me because my training was being a wildlife biologist, and which means I like to be in the middle of nowhere by myself. And so...
not quite how policy works.
No, it's not quite how policy. And I knew nothing. I knew, it hadn't been something I had focused on. I hadn't focused on policy. I was in my own little bubble. And, I didn't know how to speak in front of people. Like, I'd never had to do that, So, when Andy's father passed away, it was sort of like, okay, all hands on deck. I've been going to these meetings, I've been engaging, I've been doing these things, but obviously I can't do that anymore. I have to totally focus on the ranch. So you go. And it was right about the time when we were in a huge fight with Pima County over land use. They were trying to take away our rights to farm. And so, my first exposure to policy was basically going to Tucson twice a week and sitting in meetings where people that didn't know you talked about your livelihood and what you were doing and told lies about you, and the county basically talking about how they didn't need you. So it was a rough entrance, but you know what? Baptism by fire is always a good thing when it's sustaining, right?
Well, and I love what you say about all of the lessons you've learned, because so much of it could be applied to life in general. I mean, facing the challenges, just keep going, and there's ups and downs, and you just find a way. So I think that's a really good lesson in general. And you were talking about all the economic ups and downs too, and just to switch gears a little bit, economically, talk a little bit to our listeners about the economics of the industry as a whole, because we really try to connect our consumers to where their food comes from, but also the impact it has on the environment and their lifestyle and the state's income.
Sure. Well, agricultural markets are difficult because if you're growing a commodity, you don't have any control over, if the price of fuel goes up, and I'm sure guests have talked about this on your show before, if the price of fuel goes up, if the price of labor goes up, all of the inputs that it takes, and just like with any business, if the price goes up, the difference is if I were making tennis shoes, I could raise the price of those tennis shoes to cover that. Growing beef and any other kind of commodity, you can't. You have to absorb it. And so right now, the cattle market, and people will know that, your listeners, they go to the grocery store and they're like, oh my gosh, beef is so expensive. This isn't the first time beef has been expensive in the grocery store, but it is the first time, like I said, in probably 2 generations where the rancher is actually able to pay off debt. And that's important because what happens in agriculture is you take on debt and you take on more debt and you take on more debt. And sometimes that's one growing cycle, like people in the Midwest. Most people would freak out if they knew the operating line of a farmer in Iowa that's growing corn and sorghum or whatever, or these guys down in Yuma that are growing specialty crops. The amount of risk that they take every beginning of a growing season, invest that into their crop and just hope that they get it back by the time, sometimes you can contract ahead, meaning you can figure out who you're going to sell to. They'll give you the price, and that's what it is. But if you lose that crop for some reason, all that risk is on you. Some people in agriculture have insurance, some people don't. So in terms of the cattle market, this is the first time that I have seen where beef is expensive in the grocery store, but this is the first time where ranchers are actually being able to take that opportunity and pay off debt. And that matters in the long run. And I think a lot of times people, I probably shouldn't say this, but I think a lot of times people think that people in agriculture should be completely philanthropic. Like, aren't you just doing this for the benefit of everyone else? And, they have that old-fashioned picture of the farmer and the rancher with the pitchfork, and we're supposed to be dirt poor all the time, and we're supposed to be suffering, and, what is the life of a farmer if he's not suffering? And I think, why is that? Why is it that farmers and ranchers are expected to always be in a rough year and always be in sacrifice and say, oh, okay, well, I'm going to cobble something together so I can get to the next season? We're just like any other business. In order to make investments in your business, so that's one thing I'll say for sure. Because the cattle market is good right now, a lot of ranchers are able to invest back in their own businesses. And a lot of those investments are conservation actions, are things that they couldn't afford before. It's technology that they couldn't afford before. And that's only a good thing. That's only a good thing for the consumer. And so when consumers go to the meat case and they see $5 a pound for a hamburger, they can know that the ranchers that are way down the list, the very beginning of that process, for the first time in 50 years are able to take that money that they're getting from those cattle and put it back into the ranch and do better for the landscape. And I think that should make consumers proud too.
Yeah, and you employ a number of people, and then the product goes to processing plants, and a lot of people are employed. So it's contributing in a number of ways to the economy.
And just in terms of looking at the top commodities in the state of Arizona, for our listeners, it goes back and forth between dairy and cattle, and but that's just measuring cash receipts. And some years, like you said, are going to be better than others. What I'm struck with, having grown up on a farm, it felt like there were more lean years than boom years. But just like you said, when we have those boom years, our farmers and ranchers are smart business professionals. They're going to reinvest in their business. They're also, if they're really wise and want to be generational, they have to take that 5, 10, maybe it's 15% in the boom year and shove it away so that they're saving / investing. So when we have a boom year in agriculture, all of us need to celebrate it, because I think boom years for all of us ultimately benefit every one of us. So what makes Arizona's cattle industry unique, specifically here in Arizona, compared to the West? Or maybe it's more fair to ask the question, our cattle industry in the West compared to the Midwest? I mean, there's a lot of differences. However you want to answer that question, but what makes Arizona cattle industry so special?
Well, I think it's special because, basically a few different things set us apart from the Midwest and even other parts of the West. Obviously, our climate here is very important to us. What that means for ranchers is basically herd health. We're not basically having to fight a lot of the pests that they fight in the South. A lot of the animal pests they fight in the South, the diseases, funguses, different things like that. We don't have to deal with that here because of our dry climate. We can calve year-round here. Not everybody does that. We do that on our ranch, but not everybody does that, but they can if they wanted to do that. So that sets us apart for sure.
So you have a breeding cycle that's a little bit more robust, is what you're saying. When you say calving, that's...
Yeah. So basically, what happens on probably most ranches is they have a calving season, and so they basically put their bulls in with their cows and their heifers at a certain time to make sure their calves are born at a certain time. And then if they know that, then they know what weight they're going to be at a certain time. And so everything is very planned and cyclical, and we choose chaos on our place. But no, it's not really. It is sort of chaotic, but it's good because we don't have to put all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak. And so we're able to spread that income out throughout the year, because some bills come at certain times of year and some come at different times. And so I think that makes us very unique in Arizona as well, is that ability, that reproduction advantage that we have. And then, of course, the herd health advantage that we have. And back in the olden days, everybody thought Arizona was just a bunch of desert cattle. And typically desert cattle don't grade as high as like Angus, Hereford, whatever. But I think for the most part, people in Arizona have really figured out how to raise more English type cattle, which grade higher. And so we may not have the number of head like they have in the Midwest, but the quality is there. And I think that's important. So
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And with Arizona, we do have a relatively large beef cattle industry. Do we do any exporting, or do you do any exporting? And have tariffs at all been involved in the exporting of beef?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, most of the cattle that's raised in Arizona is exported per se to, if at a minimum, to other states. Mm-hmm. We don't have the infrastructure in Arizona to, in terms of feedlots and finishing, for finishing and processing. Mm-hmm. We do have some, and we have some people, all of our processing is not for big capacity. It's very much so, smaller number of head. And some people do that direct. But in terms of the finishing of the cattle, we don't have a lot of feedlots either. Mm-hmm. So almost all of the cattle that are born and raised in Arizona go somewhere else to be finished. That doesn't mean that the meat doesn't come back for people in Arizona to eat it, but we just don't have the infrastructure here. And that was really highlighted during COVID, was places that didn't have the infrastructure to finish out agriculture from start to finish. So there's been some advances in that in Arizona. There's been some new processing places that have opened. But again, it's for the quality of cattle we have in Arizona and the number, we need to take those cattle to a different area that can take higher capacity.
But now if it's direct market or retail beef, which for the listener, you're feeding it out and you're harvesting it, not yourself, but there are some local harvest places, and very limited here in Arizona. Otherwise, more cattle ranchers would do that. Usually they're even finishing their beef too. Yeah. But all of a sudden, you've gone from a grand scale to a very small scale. So those numbers are limited. Am I on the right track?
It's almost two totally different worlds. I mean, you're still trying to get to the same end product, but the process is quite a bit different. University of Arizona just revamped their whole meat processing facility. I think that's great. It's a great investment in the cattle industry in Arizona. But it's still, they can't process that many head. So that's difficult for direct marketing here in Arizona. If you want to direct market, it's very difficult to get into a processing facility here. We do a little bit of it, but it's just so little of it because it's so hard to get into a processing facility. And if you build a customer base, customers want, that's the whole thing about the American consumer. It's just in time, right? Like when they want something, they want it. And if it's not there, then they divert their attention to something else.
Right.
I do the same thing, right? It's like I show up at the store. Well, if the bread that I wanted that day at the bakery is not there, well, I'm not going to come back to the store because I drove all the way over here and it wasn't here, right? Mm-hmm. So as direct marketing in beef, you really have to be able to provide that continually. That's why we have trade, right? You asked about trade. A lot of people say, well, why do we import products from other countries anyway? Why don't we grow everything here? Well, because if you're growing lettuce, right, in Yuma, you're not going to be able to produce that year round. And so, but you want the consumer to keep buying it. You want it to be a continual part of their plate, right? And so you welcome bringing in products, from other countries. Either we don't grow it here or you want to sustain the market.
Like bananas and kiwis.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and like oranges, we can't grow oranges year round. And so we bring in oranges from other places. And so just the right amount of imports is good. Too much imports is bad, and trying to find that, that balance is important. As far as the trade, the greater thing that's going on in the world, some good things are going on. We have a new agreement with the UK. Mm-hmm. That's going to be great for the beef industry because of the fact that, they had pretty high tariffs. It was like 20% or something. We made a deal that they're going to take those away. They're going to somewhat loosen their requirements that are unscientific and really have no basis. But it also puts a quota on what can be imported here from the UK. So there's still trade negotiations happening. The demand for beef is so high right now, even within our own country, that I think that's what's sustaining the market right now. You have a very high demand. You have a low supply. We're at record lows. We have fewer cattle than we've had in 60 years. But I want to clarify, because I hear a lot of people say that. That doesn't necessarily mean that our beef supply is the lowest it's been in 60 years. that just means that the number of head. So over the last many years, what we've done is we've improved genetics so much in the beef industry that one animal produces a lot more meat.
Okay.
So it's not that we're producing a lot less beef right now. It's just that we have a lot less head. And a lot of people hear that like, oh, they take that for all different reasons, right? Like, oh, I'm going to get into the cattle business because, it's really low supply. Or consumers say, oh my gosh, what are we going to run out of beef? No, the main thing I believe that is driving the market right now is demand. There's a high demand for beef. So, in the dairy business, it seems like there's a wheel, the agricultural wheel, you spin it, and when it stops, you're the target, right?
Yeah.
And so for a long time, beef was the target. And everybody said, don't eat red meat, don't eat red meat, da-da-da-da-da. Well, now everybody's saying, eat red meat. And, our health secretary is talking about tallow and how important it is. And so in agriculture, again, that's the peaks and valleys of the market. You have to be ready to take advantage of when you're not the target.
Right.
And when you can benefit from those things. And so global demand is high because more people have risen in their economic stability to buy meat. And national demand is high because people are on the keto diet.
Right.
Everyone wants more protein.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a renaissance, we've concluded, and Tammy certainly in the dairy industry can speak to it more, but there's a renaissance in both dairy and beef. And it's because the research coming out and the nutritionists that are really testing this are really pushing the point and the truth that animal fat is healthy fat and we need to be eating it. So that's all a good thing. So this demand issue is spot on and we need to keep it going. And I love a nice tender steak. So a lot of times people will say that sustainability practices in ranching and profitability are not compatible. The ranchers I talk to, including the Smallhouse family, we're just talking to Stephanie, that's not the case. There's a place for all of the sustainability, conservation practices, improvements. Look how you've improved the genetics with your beef. Same with the dairy. Talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible to be profitable without being sustainable with your natural resources. Mm-hmm. Folks that aren't taking care of their natural resources, whether that's water, or soils, or grasses, or whatever, are going to go out of business because you have to have that regeneration of that over and over and over again. And so if you're not trying to be innovative and creative in terms of natural resource management and sustainability, then I don't think you're going to be sustainable business-wise. I think that, going back to just my previous statement, sustainability in terms of business and sustainability in terms of natural resources all depend on demand. And tie it back with, if the cattle market is good, then ranchers are able to invest back into their land. And that makes them more sustainable because it's very cyclical. So I don't think that's true. I think it's actually the opposite. I think that if you are not managing your land and water resources sustainably, then you're never going to be profitable. So.
Yeah, and like I said, every time I talk to my farmers and ranchers and I hear about their sustainability practices, whether it be related to natural resources or the sustainability of you have to be profitable to sustain so that, your son, if he wants to come back to the ranch, is able to come back to the ranch. So I've always felt, and having grown up on the farm, that they're completely compatible. It's just that the narrative has kind of been skewered in the public, and I think that's changing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now this question's kind of for both of you because you work for Arizona Farm Bureau and you've worked very closely over the years with Arizona Farm Bureau, but talk a little more. You mentioned it a little bit as the safety net, some of the programs that are out there, but how the Arizona Farm Bureau helps really to preserve ranching and help the modern rancher.
Sure. I think I was thinking, I speak to things still like I'm the president because I'm talking about all these different commodities. I'm only here to talk about beef. So I'm trying to focus. But anyway, Arizona Farm Bureau is basically meets ranchers where they're at, right? And so we have a presence in every county, and any rancher is able to bring those concerns to Farm Bureau, and it's a grassroots process. Arizona Farm Bureau is really good at the big picture because, everybody has their own industry group, right? You have UDA, United Dairymen, you have the cotton producers, you have the cattle growers, whatever, cotton growers, cattle growers. They specialize in very specific, nuanced issues. Farm Bureau is very good at focusing on the big picture issues like water, property rights, the Farm Bill, things like that. Those other groups are too, but I feel like our spread of, or our ability to reach in and make connections on all of those things is very broad. And so I think that we do a good job at that. And that obviously impacts ranchers where they're at, right? In terms of water availability. You asked me about why is ranching so important or what sets it apart here. And one of the things I didn't mention that I think is important to mention is that the feedstuffs we have in Arizona are amazing. We have farmers here who are very good at growing alfalfa. We have cotton growers here who have cottonseed. We have the availability here locally of very high quality, nutritious feedstuffs year round. And so Farm Bureau basically is bringing those feedstuff producers together with ranchers, and just to be able to network and have that continual conversation of what's going on in your world, this is what's going on in my world, we depend upon each other. Same with the dairy industry, right? Mm-hmm. Dairy and beef cattle are very closely connected because we both share the same feedstuffs and we both share the same market sometimes. Uh-huh. And so that's what I always felt like when I was heavily involved with Farm Bureau was I loved the fact that it brought all of these groups together to sort of cross-communicate so we weren't stepping on each other's toes, right? And so we were able to have a conversation about something, about water, and say, that's a very broad topic that covers everybody, and say, well, this is how what you think is going to impact me. How can we think about this a little bit differently so we both, are benefited? And so I think that's really where Farm Bureau's strength is, especially when you're just dealing with one industry at a time, like ranching. It's a huge asset to be able to bring people together. And so I think that's very important.
I'm always learning from Julie, too, because I'm used to the human nutrition side of things and then just the dairy side, but to hear about all of the different areas that you play in with Farm Bureau.
Oh, I have so much fun.
Yeah.
And I learned so much from you. So it's a mutual admiration club. And Steph, a lot of times you don't like me to focus on this, but I'm going to do it anyway. First of all, could have you ever imagined that you were going to be president for the Arizona Farm Bureau? You happen to be our first female president. I am not into identity politics. That's not what I'm saying. But it's just fun as a communicator to identify that unique thing. There's a wall of presidents at the headquarters of the Arizona Farm Bureau.
One of these things does not belong here. No, just kidding.
Oh, behave. But could have you ever imagined, because I know in all those policy meetings that you went to, and just as simply as a volunteer leader at the county, and then ultimately she ended up as president. So, okay, enough on that, but I just wanted to give you props on that. It's just been...
Thank you, Julie.
You're welcome. Fun working with you. What are the key... Now we're going to completely pivot back to the ranching world. What are the key benefits of ranchers managing public lands in Arizona and in the West in general, both for the environment and for the public? We kind of forget that I, as a public beneficiary of the public lands, I sometimes forget what the ranchers are doing for me.
Sure, it's just like anything else that if you don't see it and you don't have direct contact with it, you don't necessarily know what the benefits of that are. And so a lot of people that visit public lands and recreate on public lands, they don't think about the fact that there's someone there pretty much 24/7 for different purposes in those places where it seems like nobody even knows where they are, right? And so whether that's, managing the actual grasses, which becomes extremely important when you're talking about wildfires, when you're just talking about carbon sequestration, the soils, how those... If you have basically a lot of trees and no understory, no grasses, your carbon sequestration is not going to be as good. So there are a lot of roles that ranchers can play in those public lands, from the actual management of the resources, from providing waters, On our ranch, we have waters every 2 miles. During, COVID, during 2020, one of the driest years, 12-month period on record, Game and Fish was actually reaching out to ranchers and saying, even if you don't have cattle out there, can you please keep your waters going because there's no water. And the fact that there was no water had nothing to do with whether the rancher was there or not. It was the fact that there was no water and it was a drought. But the fact that ranchers were there and had put in the infrastructure and put in the work and maintained those waters became extremely valuable to those wildlife. And that's pretty much an everyday occurrence. Those wildlife are benefiting from that water maintenance, from those infrastructure pieces. On our ranch, we partner a lot with the Arizona Desert Bighorn Sheep Society because we have a herd that lives there in the Redfield Canyon area. And we've been able to partner with them quite a bit on different waters because, we might have a water that's difficult for us to maintain. And so instead of us saying, yeah, we're just not going to maintain that anymore, we work with the Desert Bighorn Sheep Society and say, you know what do you need? How can we help you? Let's help each other because we know the sheep have become accustomed, to that water. And so we're partnering with them and we're working together. And that's not a unique story. There's ranchers all over the state that are partnering with nonprofits and the Game and Fish. So it's basically having that presence there. We had a range con in Arizona years ago that basically I'm not going to remember all the numbers, but basically did a write-up of if you take everyone that works on a ranch in Arizona, take all those ranches, let's assume that every ranch has at least 2 employees, which many ranches have more than 2 employees. But if you took every ranch, so I think at that time the numbers were like 5,000. If you took every ranch had 2 employees, that's 10,000 employees out there on the land watching for people who are in danger, helping people change their tires, providing water to wildlife, managing the grasses. When there's wildfires, helping assist with water locations and road conditions and all these things, right? So you take all those people who are basically working for free for the country because nobody's paying them to do it. They're not federal employees, but yet they're caretaking public lands. And so nobody takes that seriously until you're the one that's stranded on some mountain road in the middle of nowhere. You don't take that seriously, but it's happened to a lot of people. I know Andy has helped a lot of people on our ranch in emergency situations. So even if it's just that, it's a huge deal.
Yeah. One thing I like to point out to people too is a lot of the ranchers that I hang out with that tell me their stories, you guys say, I reintroduced native grasses because of a fire or just lack, like they picked up help me if I don't have all this right, but they picked up a new permit, so they have cattle on it. Well, for the first time, they're realizing, gosh, this area needs a lot of care. So they reintroduce native grasses. They, again, provide those water tanks for their, obviously priority is their cattle, but they know that the residual benefit, and even more so, will be the wildlife. And I love it when my ranchers send me a picture that shows both the cattle drinking with the wildlife. There is one picture I noticed, and the rancher said, my cattle stayed back until the black bear left. But there was a black bear that was drinking, and then once he lumbered off, the cattle
There's a certain priority at the
there
drinking
is a
hole.
certain priority, but I just thought that was the coolest story.
Well, and I'll tell you a unique story, I think that, for our place, going back to your question, farmers and ranchers are generally the people who sit on natural resource conservation boards. And a lot of people, your listeners, might not be familiar with that. But basically, that's the army of people across the whole United States that are volunteer leaders for conservation on working lands. That's the simplest I can sum it up. Both Andy and I have served on our local conservation district board. Our conservation district board with the neighboring conservation district board has been in the lead and on the forefront as fighting for the soil resources in southern Arizona. The largest solar-powered electric 500 kV line in the United States right now is being built from New Mexico to Arizona to provide power to California. The only people on the ground that care about what's happening during that construction and the soil erosion, those delicate desert soils, are the people on this conservation board. Andy is on the phone probably, it used to be, I felt like he was talking to somebody every day from the power line saying, what are you doing about this? You put the wattles in the wrong place. You're never going to slow down the water if you do this. And actually made them come back out and say, look at this. This is the way it should be done. I know you're from the Midwest, but we don't have that much rain here. You need to change this around to capture the soil, not let it all run down. We don't have a ton of topsoil here. Our desert, topsoils are very valuable. So these are farmers and ranchers that sit on these boards. They're the ones that are out there when stuff like infrastructure and power lines are going in. They're the ones that are saying, you know what, I'm fifth generation on this ranch. I don't want to be the generation that turned and looked the other way when all of this erosion happened. You don't get that from just regular people. They don't know that's going on. And people who are paid to manage the resources, they're not there in the off hours, right? They're not there to see things happening. So I think that's a really good example of when you have ranchers out on the land, you have somebody out there that actually feels like that power line is impacting me personally. And so I think that that's really important too.
That's a great example. I think, first of all, a lot of people don't even realize that it is public land and that you're helping to maintain it, and it's such a delicate ecosystem to keep everything in balance. I know we have a couple horses we'll take out riding sometimes, and we'll run across some of those big water troughs and some of the trails and things. And you really are the boots on the ground. People can manage things from afar, but they don't really know what's going on in detail or understand every area.
Well, yeah, and I think people that are in that process, particularly what I was talking about, that are getting paid, it's sort of like one of those things where it's like, well, I told that guy 6 times that that's not going to work, but whatever. At the end of the day, I'm not going to lose my job. I'm going to go on to the next thing or whatever. And that's not to disparage those people. But the point I make in talking about that is the difference it makes for someone who lives there and is going to live with whatever it is that's happening. And that person saying, no, this is not acceptable, and I'm not going to give up on this until you notice me and respond. And that's what Andy's been doing.
And Andy, he can be a bulldog.
You know how Andy is.
When he needs to be.
When he gets something in his teeth, he doesn't like
And I'm glad he's that way. And a public service announcement, if you come to a closed gate and it's not locked and you decide to go through it on your horses or your off-highway vehicles, make sure you stop long enough, turn around, and close that gate again. Public service announcement by Julie Murphy.
We always do. We're very careful about that.
Good.
I will tell you.
I bet you are. But we speak to that because we've actually written articles, produced videos, because that's the bane of another one of the banes of a rancher's existence is people that, these are public lands are multi-use, and they'll go through a gate and they just don't think about it and they don't shut it behind them. But just simple things like that make a huge difference.
Yeah, it's sort of like going to somebody's house and leaving the water on. Like, it matters. Yeah. You may be leaving, but it matters that you're running. You know what I mean? It's like you leave the gate open, your cattle get in the wrong place. It could have, multiple impacts that they have no idea.
Absolutely. So. I know. And, changing gears just a little bit, you talked a little bit about genetics and some of the advances. Talk a little more about some of the things you've seen over the years as far as technological advances or scientific advances for the industry.
Sure. Well, I think probably, speaking directly to kind of what we're doing on our place, there's a lot of advances that have been made in genetics, and we try to stay on top of that. My husband is really trying to teach my son about the different things you should look for. He went to a bull sale for the first time a few months ago and bought 4 bulls by himself and read the sheets. I would say EPDs, but I don't know what that stands for. But it's basically the genetics. And so, he's teaching him about that. And so just knowing that is an advancement, because back in the day when Andy's dad was in charge, there wasn't that much knowledge about it. And people who did have knowledge were just like the breeders that were, very unique in what they were doing. And so Andy brought that, which brought us forward a ton in our herd health and our genetics and the way our meat grades, right? Because that's what you want. You want people to keep buying your cattle because they grade well. And so that's probably the first thing in my time that I've seen. Because we have the farm, we try to bring on any new technology with water management, whether that's center pivots. We tried drip. Everybody thinks drip is the answer. It's a very difficult thing to manage. But probably the most recent improvement that we have put in is they're called ranch bots. And so it's basically a system that we put on all of our waters. And some of our waters can take 2 hours to get to because they're so remote. And so think about that in the day, which in the day, I mean like 2 years ago, we and our employees would spend an entire day just checking 3 waters. And that's just to go make sure they're still working right. So you get there, oh, it's working right. Great. Go to the next one or whatever. And this time of year before it rains, you're doing that constantly because cattle cannot be without water for even one day in this heat. And so you're checking them constantly. So what happens if you go to a water and the float's broke? Because cows break floats all the time. Something like that. Well, now you got to drive all the way back, if you didn't bring the right part in your truck. And so it's just hugely inefficient. It's dangerous for the cattle. It's hard when you can't find labor. Nobody can find labor nowadays. And so what we've done is we put on these ranch bots, a company out of Australia actually, which basically monitors the level of the water. It sends a signal back to Andy's phone. And so he gets a signal anytime a water gets down below a certain point, and he'll know exactly, where the water is at. He can detect when there's a leak because he can see on a graph how the water's been moving. So if you're at a huge level and all of a sudden it falls, you know that you've got a leak. Well, in Arizona, it's pretty important to fix the leak. So this is something that we're using on our ranch most recently, and it's made a huge difference in man hours, in fuel, driving all over the place, in truck maintenance, driving on these rough roads. So even the littlest advancement can make a huge difference. There's other advancements that are happening in the beef industry, specifically like in dairy. It's really in dairy. But again, dairy impacts the beef industry greatly. And I actually think it'll be quite disruptive. Good things always come out of disruption. Bad things come out of disruption. It's all the way that you anticipate it, like we talked about earlier. But, like in dairy right now, they're so focused on technology and being efficient, which is good. That's really good. But they've done so much with genetics and embryos and all these different things. At some point, dairies are going to be as much beef producers as they are milk producers. And they're going to be able to do that in such an organized way, basically decide, do I want this calf to be a heifer or do I want this calf to be a bull? And, how much do I want to make on beef this year? And they can take the genetics. They're not just dealing with Holstein genetics or Jersey genetics. They could take the Angus genetics or the embryo, put it in that mother cow, raise that calf, do it all at the same time, be completely synchronized, raise them on the same feed. So it's basically like from birth to they can finish it in the feedlot. They can do all of that in one place and extremely consistently. And that all has to do with reproduction. And I think Arizona is going to play a big part in that because of our climate, because our dairy cattle and our dairymen are so amazing, but it's going to be hugely disruptive to ranchers because we can't do that.
And we also visited with one of our dairy farmers along that lines. That it's the RFID tags, right, that comprise or can gather all that data on one cow, and instead of having, I think she called them cow cards. That were all in a file and all written by hand, and just the sophistication with technology today.
They can monitor that whole cow's life 24/7 and know instantly when it's sick. And they measure how much food they eat,
the movement of the cow.
And these are things that ranchers
yes.
can't do. I mean, we have cattle out there that we might not see, for a while, and so it's going to be a game changer in terms of actual beef production. But there'll be opportunity there in marketing, and different things. So we'll see. But to me, that's something big. The RFID technology, we put EID tags in our animals. It's something that we get a premium for our cattle, and so a lot of ranchers don't do it. But we do it because we want to be able to say that we know that our beef can be tracked, from exactly where it came from, which means our beef can be sold to certain places that they require that.
Wow. So EID is pretty much similar to an RFID tag?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
How to say that slowly?
We can't get all
a lot of letters.
Yeah, we don't have all the high tech that the dairies have, but we can track an animal from the time it leaves to the ranch. But there's also technology now on ranches. It's just kind of it's too expensive right now, but to where you can move your animals with virtual fences.
Yes.
And so that's being tested in a lot of kind of university settings and experimental ranches that are associated.
The U of A is working on
the U of A is working on it. but it's super expensive. And so that'll be a while before that's available to the masses in terms of ranches. So
And literally, because they have these collars on them, they get a little buzz. It's not painful.
sometimes it's music.
Yeah, sometimes,
Yeah.
and it will keep the cattle in a certain area and will also move them to where you want them to go.
Yeah, it's
Right?
it's hugely it'll be hugely impactful when it's more available to ranchers in the West because of the fact that our ranches are so rugged and so big.
They are,
So-
yeah. Okay, on another topic, what do you consider some of the biggest threats today in the cattle industry?
You know, I think it's hard to say that because I think everybody deals with their own kind of greatest threat. The greatest threat to our business, and we've been in business for over 140 years, so you think that we would be pretty sustainable. We would be, oh, you're good to go. You figured this thing out. But, I talked about how we have the farms there and how important those farms are to our program and to our management of the resources. And, we're fighting for our water. And so for us specifically, that's the biggest threat right now, I would say for us. For other ranchers, their biggest threat is going to be recreation. If you live up by Prescott or by Sedona, your biggest threat is that you're just being overrun by recreationists leaving gates open. So it's like nearly impossible to manage your operation. If you cannot manage your operation properly, you can't be profitable. You can't take care of the land. So I think everybody's threat is a little bit different. If you're a big exporter, you're worried right now, right? Because of everything that's going on. So it's kind of hard to put it in one category. It just sort of depends on each rancher's business plan, where they are, what they're dealing with. We have ranchers that are in eastern Arizona. Their biggest threat probably right now is wolves.
Yeah.
When the market is so, when it's so beneficial right now, and when you're basically for the first time be able to pay off debt, and every calf you lose is a huge impact to your budget. They're dealing with that. So if you ask them, they might say, well, the wolves, we're being overrun by wolves.
Yep.
So it's just really hard to put into one category.
Different threats in different regions based on different settings and all sorts of contributing factors. So this has been a great interview. We've learned a lot, and I always learn from you, Stephanie, and have always enjoyed my visits with you. What if we wrap this up, and we're talking mostly to consumers, most likely listeners that, maybe somewhere back in their 3 or 4 generations had somebody that was in ranching, but it's not really their play today. They're in other business endeavors, raising families. You've got the podium, so to speak. You've certainly got the mic. What are you going to encourage consumers today about beef and its nutrient density and how healthy and tasty it is?
Well,
we
all
can
of
talk
those-
about that forever.
all of those things. If I were standing in the grocery store and a consumer, like I said, walked up to me today and, you stand next to another mom or, a dad or whatever looking at the meat case and it just always happens to a rancher, oh my gosh, why is this so expensive, And, so if I were to turn and, and speak to that person at the meat case, I'd say, well, 2 years worth of work went into that 1 pound of hamburger. It took that rancher 2 years to raise that pound of hamburger. It took him generations to create the environment to raise it in just the perfect way to provide it to you today. That's what I would say. And I think people forget just how much work goes into raising food and fiber.
That's awesome,
That's
Stephanie. What do you
great.
think,
And
Tammy?
I think since it's your birthday today, you need to go out and have a nice big steak.
That's
I
right.
think I will take your counsel on that one because I've decided that the nutrition ninja, that's what I call her, she's my personal nutritionist. My nervousness is you'll start charging me.
Okay. Never.
But thanks again, Stephanie, and we want to have you back, we hope. I know that we've stolen your time, but you've really enriched our understanding of the ranching life and how important the beef industry is here in Arizona.
I'm happy to be here and always happy to speak about ranching and agriculture and the people who do it. So
Yeah, your passion is obvious, and we really appreciate it. I've learned so much today. Thank you so much.